Eli Ramsey had seen enough of war to last a lifetime. After 2 decades serving as a combat medic, he needed an escape. The constant sound of gunfire, the stench of smoke, the sight of too many lives lost. He was done with it all. So when the Army gave him the chance to retire early, he jumped at it. He wanted nothing more than peace, something he hadn't felt in years. He found it in the remote mountains of Montana. A small cabin, nestled on a plot of land far from the nearest town, was the perfect place to disappear. It was simple: a wood stove for heat, a generator for power, and just enough space to store supplies for the harsh winters. He built it with his own hands, using the skills he learned while in the field. It was a world apart from the chaos he'd left behind, and that's exactly what he needed. The first few months were quiet. His days consisted of long hikes through the woods, checking the traps he'd set for food, and maintaining the cabin. His nights were spent by the fire, reading or writing in a journal that had become his only true companion. The quiet was comforting, almost therapeutic. Every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of wildlife: deer wandering through the trees, the occasional mountain lion on the hunt. But for the most part, it was just him and the land. But there was a strange kind of stillness to it all. The kind of silence that made a man's thoughts louder, sharper. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him was still waiting for a call to action. The soldier in him hadn't fully gone away. He was used to trusting his instincts. In the Army, those instincts had saved his life more times than he could count. And it wasn't just his own life he'd saved. It was others too. So when he woke up early one cold January morning to a sound that didn't belong, he didn't hesitate. It was a faint cry, barely audible over the howling wind. His first thought was that it was an injured animal. A deer perhaps, caught in a trap or struggling to survive the bitter cold. His heart raced as he grabbed his jacket and headed out into the snow. This wasn't the kind of morning that anyone would expect to find anything alive. The temperature was well below freezing, and the landscape was a blanket of white, untouched and still. But Eli's instincts told him something was out there, and he was going to find out what. Eli's boots crunched against the snow as he made his way down the narrow trail. The wind bit at his face, and the sky was a dull gray, the clouds thick and heavy. Despite the cold, the cry had drawn him forward. It wasn't like the usual sounds of the forest, the low hum of the wind, the distant call of a bird, or the rustling of small animals hiding from predators. This was different. It was a cry of distress, one that seemed to cut through the icy air and tug at something deep inside him. He moved quickly, following the sound. It was faint but persistent, like a soft whimper, carried by the wind but unmistakable. After a few minutes, he arrived at the clearing where the sound seemed to be coming from. His eyes scanned the area, trying to pinpoint the source, and then he saw it, just barely beneath a heavy snowdrift and a pile of broken branches. There was a shape, 2 tiny forms, barely visible against the white landscape. Eli's heart skipped a beat. He pushed aside the snow and branches with his hands, not caring about the freezing cold that bit into his skin. When he uncovered the small figures, his breath caught in his throat. There, shivering and almost motionless, were 2 wolf pups, too small, too vulnerable to be out here alone in the dead of winter. The pups were in bad shape. Their fur, though thick, was matted and frozen in places. Their breathing was shallow, their little bodies trembling uncontrollably. They were barely conscious, their eyes half open and glazed, as though the world around them had already started slipping away. The realization hit him hard. These pups wouldn't last much longer without help. Without thinking twice, Eli scooped them up, one in each arm, and started to head back toward his cabin. The cold gnawed at him as he walked, but the urgency in his chest kept him going. He knew he had to get them to shelter, warmth, and food. Fast. As he moved, his mind raced. How had they ended up here, alone and abandoned in the freezing wilderness? Wolves were strong, resilient creatures, but these pups were too young, too fragile. They didn't stand a chance on their own. When he reached the cabin, Eli gently laid them on the floor near the wood stove. He closed the door and hurried to prepare a safe place for them to recover. His training kicked in, the same instincts that had kept him alive in combat. He didn't waste time thinking. He wrapped the pups in blankets, carefully applying heat to their chilled bodies, all the while checking their breathing. His hands worked automatically, but his mind kept drifting back to the sight of those pups. Something didn't sit right with him, but for now, all he could do was focus on keeping them alive. The next few days were a blur of care and caution. Eli's cabin, once a peaceful refuge, became a makeshift animal hospital. He kept the pups close to the fire, checking on them constantly. He made sure they ate regularly, using the old techniques he learned to nurse injured soldiers back to health. Feeding them small amounts of goat's milk mixed with vitamins, keeping them hydrated, and massaging their tiny limbs to get the blood flowing. At first, Eli wasn't sure they would make it. Their shivering persisted for hours, and their tiny bodies were so fragile it felt like they might slip away at any moment. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, their condition began to improve. The trembling eased, their breathing grew steadier, and within a few days, they were moving around a little, their wide eyes taking in the strange new world around them. Eli, however, was left to grapple with the unsettling realization that he was growing attached to them. He hadn't expected that. He'd always believed animals were just animals, there to survive, to live their lives, and nothing more. But Ash and Ember, as he'd come to call them, were different. There was something about them that felt almost human. He noticed it the first time Ash made eye contact with him. The pup was sitting by the stove, watching him with an intensity that was unnerving. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as though Ash was studying him, understanding him, as if trying to make sense of who this man was and why he was suddenly in their lives. Ember, though smaller and more skittish, showed the same watchfulness. They would follow him around the cabin, always keeping a careful distance but never out of sight. And when he would talk to them, soft, reassuring words, they seemed to listen, their ears perking up in recognition. The connection between Eli and the pups grew stronger every day. The more he interacted with them, the more he realized they were different from any wolves he'd encountered in his years of wilderness survival. He had spent enough time in the wild to know how elusive and independent wild animals could be. Wolves, especially, were fiercely territorial and rarely trusted humans. Yet here were two pups, not only surviving in a human-made environment, but thriving in it, seeking his company, responding to his voice, and even seeming to understand him in ways that were beyond instinct. Eli shook his head as he watched them play in front of the fire, chasing after a makeshift toy he'd made from a piece of old rope. He had a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that he couldn't shake, that these pups weren't just victims of a harsh winter. There was something more to their story, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But for now, all he could do was care for them, trying to push the strange feeling aside. The bond between him and the pups was undeniable, and for the first time in years, Eli felt something he hadn't expected: hope. As the weeks passed, Eli's life began to revolve around the pups. He'd always been a man of routine: wake up early, check the traps, tend to the fire, and prepare for the next day. But now there was something new that tugged at his attention. Ash and Ember. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving in a way that unsettled him. It wasn't just their recovery that caught him off guard. It was their intelligence. It started out small. One afternoon, after a long day of chopping wood, Eli returned to find Ember sitting by the door, her head cocked to one side as though waiting for him. He chalked it up to coincidence, but the next day, Ash did the same thing, sitting by the door with those piercing amber eyes fixed on him, as if he knew exactly when Eli was about to return. At first, Eli tried to ignore it. Maybe they were just getting used to him, he thought. Maybe it was just a quirk of the pup's growing awareness. But then it happened again. And again. Ash and Ember began to anticipate his every move. He'd open the pantry door to grab some food, and Ember would already be standing there, looking up at him as though she'd known he would need it. One evening, after sitting by the fire reading, Eli reached for a blanket, only to find Ash tugging it closer to him with his teeth, as though offering warmth before he even asked for it. The more Eli observed, the more he realized something wasn't right. Wild animals, especially young ones, relied heavily on instinct. They didn't perform actions with this kind of purpose, this level of awareness. Ash and Ember were different. They were thinking. It wasn't just their ability to anticipate his needs. It was their eyes. The way they studied him, the way they followed him from room to room, not out of dependency but out of curiosity, almost as if they were trying to understand him. They would watch him with an intensity that felt almost human. When he spoke to them, they seemed to react, their ears twitching or their tails wagging in response to the tone of his voice. Eli wasn't sure what to make of it, but there was one thing he knew for sure. These pups weren't just ordinary wolves. There was something else about them, something that didn't add up. It wasn't until one evening, when Eli was sitting by the stove, that he had the first real glimpse of their extraordinary abilities. Ash, sitting across the room, locked eyes with him, then raised his paw, gesturing toward the woodpile in the corner. It wasn't a bark or a whine. It was a purposeful, deliberate gesture, as though he was asking for something. Eli stared at the pup for a long moment, then slowly walked over to the woodpile, unsure of what was happening. When he returned with an armful of logs, he found both pups waiting by the fire, as if they had expected him to bring the wood all along. Eli sat back down, his mind racing. No wolf, no wild animal for that matter, should be able to communicate like this. Not in the way they did. The day was clear and cold, a perfect winter morning with the sun casting long shadows over the snow. Eli had just finished chopping firewood when he heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, steadily approaching. He paused, his hand tightening around the axe. Something about the sound unsettled him. He hadn't seen a car pass by in weeks, let alone someone coming this far into the wilderness. He glanced at Ash and Ember, who were playing near the cabin's edge. The pups had grown more confident over the past few weeks, running through the snow with an agility that surprised him. Yet, despite their increasing independence, they always stayed close to him, alert and cautious when strangers appeared. Their ears perked up, and their eyes locked onto the trail leading toward the cabin. By the time the vehicle reached the clearing, Eli could make out the shape of a black SUV, creeping slowly along the snow-packed road. His pulse quickened. No one came out here unless they had a reason, one he didn't like. He grabbed his rifle from the cabin and leaned it against the wall, just in case. He'd spent enough time in hostile environments to know when to be prepared. The SUV came to a stop at the end of the driveway. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark suits and heavy coats. Their boots crunched loudly against the snow as they approached the cabin. One of them, a tall man with dark sunglasses despite the cloudy day, looked around as though inspecting the land. The other, a shorter man with a sharp, calculating gaze, made a beeline for the front door. Eli didn't hesitate. He opened the door before the men had a chance to knock. His stance was calm, but his muscles were coiled tight, ready to move at a moment's notice. "Morning," Eli said, keeping his tone neutral, his eyes scanning them both. "Can I help you?" "We're with the Wildlife Agency," the taller man said, his voice smooth, but there was something cold behind it. "Just doing some routine checks on local wildlife populations. Haven't seen any unusual activity around here, have you?" Eli raised an eyebrow. The question was too vague, and the man's eyes didn't quite meet his. Something felt off, but Eli kept his composure. "Not that I've noticed," Eli replied, deliberately vague. He didn't trust these men, not for a second. His gaze shifted briefly to Ash and Ember, who were standing just inside the doorway, watching the strangers with a silent intensity. The shorter man noticed the pups immediately, his gaze sharpening. "Those aren't wild wolves," he said, his tone shifting. "Where'd you find them?" Eli felt a chill race down his spine. His mind raced, but he knew better than to panic. "They were abandoned," he said evenly, keeping his tone as casual as possible. "Found them near the creek. Just looking after them until they're strong enough to be on their own." The men exchanged a glance, and Eli caught the brief flicker of something between them. Recognition, maybe even surprise. They were searching for something, and it wasn't just the pups. "We'll be on our way," the taller man said, giving Eli a curt nod. "But if you happen to see any more unusual creatures in the area, we'd appreciate you letting us know." Eli watched them leave, his heart pounding. As soon as the SUV disappeared down the road, he locked the door and drew the curtains, his mind reeling. Those men were hiding something. And they weren't just interested in Ash and Ember. They were looking for something far more dangerous. The visit from the two men weighed heavily on Eli's mind. It wasn't just their strange behavior. It was the way they had zeroed in on Ash and Ember so quickly. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't there for a routine wildlife check. There was something more, something they weren't telling him. For days, Eli couldn't stop thinking about it. The pups had become more than just animals to him. They were his responsibility now. He couldn't afford to take chances with them. He needed answers, real answers. What were these men really looking for? And why had they shown such interest in two young wolves that should have been nothing more than a footnote in the wild? Late one evening, when the world outside was wrapped in the stillness of a heavy snowfall, Eli decided to dig deeper. He knew the internet had its share of wild conspiracy theories, but as a former soldier, he had learned how to separate fact from fiction. He wasn't looking for anything fantastical, but the truth, buried beneath layers of secrecy and misinformation. He began his search with the only clue he had, the unusual interest in the pups. After hours of digging through old reports, government archives, and obscure scientific papers, Eli finally stumbled upon something that made his heart race. There, buried in the footnotes of a forgotten journal, was a reference to a government-funded project aimed at reviving extinct animal species, specifically a long-lost wolf subspecies. The project, codenamed Project Luperca, was supposedly terminated after ethical concerns had surfaced. The paper mentioned the use of advanced genetic engineering techniques to bring the wolves back, but it was clear that the project had been classified. Eli's breath caught in his throat as he read further. The description of the experimental wolves matched Ash and Ember, down to the details of their physical characteristics. These weren't just ordinary wolves. They were the result of a genetic experiment, a revival of an ancient species long thought to be extinct. But the project had been shut down, and the creatures were supposedly destroyed. So how were these pups still alive? The implications were staggering. He could hardly believe what he was reading. But everything lined up. The unusual intelligence, the way Ash and Ember had been able to understand him and anticipate his actions, it was all connected. They weren't just victims of a harsh winter. They were something else entirely. And then Eli found the final chilling detail. The project had been classified for a reason. The research wasn't just about reviving extinct species. It was about creating weapons, biologically engineered creatures with intelligence and adaptability far beyond what nature had ever intended. Ash and Ember weren't just wild wolves. They were the product of a dangerous experiment, one that had likely been covered up. As Eli sat in the dim glow of the cabin, the weight of the truth settled over him. The men who had visited him weren't just government agents. They were trackers, looking for the remnants of something they had created. And now, the pups he had saved were at the center of a web of secrecy and danger. Eli knew that nothing would ever be the same. Eli couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. The more he pieced together, the more the truth became clear. Ash and Ember weren't just abandoned pups. They were part of something far darker, something he couldn't ignore any longer. The project, Project Luperca, was no ordinary research initiative. It had been designed for a purpose that Eli couldn't stomach, creating genetically enhanced wolves, not just for revival, but for military and strategic advantage. The thought chilled him to the bone. And those two men, those agents, had come looking for them. But why? What had happened to the rest of the project's subjects? Were Ash and Ember the only ones left? Eli had no answers, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep the pups here anymore. If they were being hunted, he wouldn't risk their safety, or his own. The next few days were filled with tension. Eli spent hours preparing for whatever might come next. He stocked up on supplies, extra food, medical kits, and gear for travel. He had the feeling that if the agents returned, he wouldn't have time to pack or make any sort of plan. Every moment felt more urgent than the last. He spent more time than usual with Ash and Ember, taking them on long walks through the forest, trying to keep them calm while still hiding their true nature. He didn't want to draw attention to them, didn't want to show how intelligent they had become, how well they understood everything around them. He could tell that the pups had grown stronger, their instincts sharper, but they still depended on him. They still needed him. One morning, Eli woke up early to find the landscape blanketed in fresh snow. There was a strange stillness in the air, and something about it felt different. His heart skipped a beat when he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine, low and rumbling, approaching from the direction of the main road. He froze, listening. It wasn't the first time he heard a vehicle in the distance, but this time it was too close, too deliberate. He rushed to the window, peering out cautiously. There, on the far edge of the clearing, was a black SUV, just like the one the agents had arrived in. His breath caught in his throat as the vehicle came to a stop. Two men stepped out, both wearing the same dark suits and cold expressions from before. This time, they weren't just casually strolling up the path. They were on a mission. Eli's pulse quickened. There was no time to waste. He grabbed his rifle and made his way to the back of the cabin, where Ash and Ember were curled up near the fire. The pups looked up at him, sensing his anxiety, their eyes wide and alert. Without a word, he ushered them into the back room, locking the door behind them. He knew they wouldn't be able to hide forever. Soon enough, those men would find them, if not today, then in the days to come. But for now, Eli would do what he had always done in dangerous situations: survive. He would protect Ash and Ember, no matter the cost. Eli's heart raced as he moved quickly through the cabin, making sure every window was secured and every door was locked. The pups, Ash and Ember, huddled quietly in the back room, their presence a reminder of the stakes. They weren't just animals anymore. They were the last link to a dangerous, buried experiment, one that had gone terribly wrong. He could hear the agents' voices now, muffled but distinct, as they approached the cabin. Eli's mind raced. He had no plan, no escape route. He'd been prepared for a lot of things in his life, but this was different. There was a sense of finality in the air. If he didn't act fast, it would be too late. The voices grew louder. They were close, too close for comfort. Eli grabbed the rifle, making sure the safety was off, and headed toward the back room. He had one shot at this, one chance to get Ash and Ember out of there before the agents found them. He opened the door slowly, his eyes falling on the pups, who had already sensed the tension. They were staring up at him, their tails still and their bodies stiff. "You ready?" Eli whispered, though he knew they couldn't answer. But something in the way Ash looked at him made it feel like the pup understood. Eli was ready. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let the men take the pups, wasn't going to let whatever dark forces were behind this project get their hands on them. He wasn't sure where he was going to go, but he would figure it out. The mountains were vast, and he knew every trail, every hidden path. If there was one place the agents wouldn't find them, it was in the wilderness he had come to call home. The front door creaked as it opened. The agents had reached the cabin. Their footsteps were heavy, purposeful. Eli felt the adrenaline flood his veins, a calm clarity overtaking the panic. He moved quickly, leading Ash and Ember through the back exit, toward the dense woods behind the cabin. The pups followed him without hesitation, their natural instincts guiding them as they darted through the snow. Eli didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The world outside the cabin had suddenly become a race against time. The agents would follow. They wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. But Eli was ready to fight for their freedom. He could hear the crackle of the radio outside the cabin, the low hum of a conversation between the agents. They were searching for him, searching for the pups. But Eli was already far enough into the woods, the thick trees surrounding him like a protective barrier. He had no idea what was waiting for him out there, but as long as he had Ash and Ember by his side, he knew he would never give up. He would protect them, no matter the cost. And as the wind howled through the trees, Eli couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The answers he sought would come, soon enough. But for now, he had one goal: survival, and he was prepared to fight for it.